Hello, everyone. It's your friendly neighborhood Michael Moberly here. We are in our third EWA Scotch Whiskey Diploma program presented by Ardbeg class. I'm super excited about this one. Today we have the Batman and Robin of Scotch. We have David Blackmore and Cameron George. David Blackmore is the Global Ardbeg and Glenmorangie Ambassador, and Cameron George is the U.S. National Ardbeg Ambassador. We got these guys here today to talk to us about illuminating the flavor and process and how they become linked when it comes to Ardbeg. They'll be building off of the process concepts we've discussed in our previous classes, which you can find at on all our channels. And they're going to be discussing the concept of maturation and flavor development. But before we dive in and jump into this, there's a few things I need you to do if you're watching. First, like us on Facebook. That's where all this stuff lives, as well as our YouTube channel. If you want to share those or look at those previous classes that I just mentioned, those are all there live, so you can look back on them, learn from them, come back to this class, or you can watch this one and go back, take some notes, check it out. You can also follow us on Instagram. That's how you find out what we're up to, when our next classes are happening, maybe when we do a program like this again. And then last but not least, make sure you ask questions. If you have questions for this dynamic duo right next to me, I'll be asking them, popping in here and there. So if you have questions, please put them in the comments. This is a unique opportunity to ask two of the most knowledgeable people in the world about all things Ardbeg. So if you have questions, these are the guys to ask. So please make sure that I can ask them. If you want me to use a funny voice while I ask it, just make sure you put that in the comments as well. So gentlemen, let's cannonball into this one. How are we feeling today?
Feeling absolutely fantastic. Apparently, we look even better, is what Sean Traxler just told us. Apparently, two very handsome gentlemen who are jumping on screen. So I'm very excited to share the screen, as always, with you, Mr. David Blackmore, my wonderful, wonderful boss, and also idol, all things Scotch whiskey. I'm a huge fan of yours. I'm really excited to raise a glass of Ardbeg Tenure with you today. Kind of tying in what we've covered over the last 3 weeks or so in terms of some of not only the Edinburgh Whiskey Academy content, but then also some of the conversations that you and I have had about Isla and originality, and then also the conversation I had with Colin Gordon last week on production as well. So this is kind of a culmination of those two things. We do have a wonderful session for you next week as well, but that's next week. That's not this week. That's next week. So, David, how are you feeling today? You ready to pour a glass of whiskey?
Absolutely, man. I mean, a glass of Ardbeg 10, you don't have to ask me twice. Absolutely. You know, the iconic Ardbeg 10. You know, and I think some people, when they first heard about the Ardbeg Wee Beastie, panicked and thought that we were kind of going to be replacing the 10 with our 5-year-old. Let me just put that nasty rumor to bed straight away. Not ever going to happen. Never. Ardbeg 10 has always been and will always be the kind of flagship expression, the purest form of Ardbeg. And it's just such a great whiskey. It's got that smokiness to it, that trademark smokiness, but it's got so much more going on in the glass as well. You know, Cam, and a lot of that can be traced back to production parameters, a little bit to terroir maybe, but mostly down to the way that we make our whiskey, the way that we choose to make our whiskey, you know?
Yeah, I think that's, we're cut from the same cloth in that regard as well, where this is my favorite whiskey from Ardbeg because it truly is the most Ardbegian of all the whiskeys. We couldn't make any of the other whiskeys in the core range, whether it's the Wee Beastie, Eno, Ugadal, or Corrie of Brecon, if we didn't make whiskeys in the style of Ardbeg Tenure, leaning on that first, second, and third fill ex-bourbon barrel pretty heavily. But I don't want to take too much away from our conversation of maturation, which we'll have a little bit. But, you know, that's why we selected this whiskey specifically to host this conversation around. Because Ardbeg Tenure really does encapsulate not only the provenance of the distillery, but then also the distillery's inherent operations as well. So, cheers and Slanjava. Let's dive into the presentation if we can go ahead and get that open. And I just saw somebody lauding the Ardbeg Tenure Daiquiri, which is of course my favorite cocktail with Ardbeg, the 10-year-old Daiquiri.
So pretty darn good, hey.
It's really tasty. You know, David's coming around. You're coming around to cocktails. It's been it's been a rocky road.
You know, I love winding you up, Cam, because the secret is I love cocktails. I don't drink as many as some people. I choose my moment to drink them, mainly health concerns more than anything, and that sugar content. I just try and keep it at bay a little bit. But I do love cocktails, and I love Ardbeg cocktails. But I also love winding you up. So
I know.
I'm never going to stop telling you what you're doing to my Ardbeg. How dare you?
It's basically once a day I can count on a text message or a WhatsApp coming from Mr. David Blackmore. Right. So I'm going to introduce you all to Grain to Glass Dramming Ardbeg style with my wonderful co-host here, the one and only David Blackmore. All things masters of smoke. This is one of my absolute favorite little introductory videos as well, because it's so bang on the nose, totally pun intended, for what I actually pull out of the glass of Ardbeg. There are definitely some savory or smoked meat components. There's a little bit of this espresso kind of tropical aspect. And then, of course, Ardbeg's best friend is lime, hence why it goes so well with the Daiquiri as well. And then there's also such an herbaceous quality and characteristic. So all of the things that I pull out of a glass of Ardbeg are actually laid out right in front of you on this little kind of teaser slide as well. But let's jump into it. We'll talk a little bit first about some of the distillery's provenance and some of the things that happen even pre-production in terms of developing the floor for Ardbeg's flavor profile. One of the largest, I guess, kind of areas of conversation that we could actually dive into today, again, totally pun intended, is Loch Ugadal in the water source and what that means for the distillery. We covered it a little bit in terms of a conversation with Colin Gordon, almost 2 weeks ago now, where we talked about the water source and the pH level. And so now let's dive into that through the lens of a glass of Ardbeg Tenure. So the pH level at Loch Ugadal is quite acidic, right? It leans very far away from the basic side of the scale. So that acidity is absolutely fantastic for kind of supercharging the secondary fermentation phase that Ardbeg kind of goes through. After the first 40 so odd hours, your yeast are no longer the dominant microorganism in the fermentation. And you start to see the ferment start to be dominated by lactobacillic acids and other inherent, you could call them infestations, right? Those are good things. And for a whiskey like Ardbeg Tenure, even though we have a relatively short fermentation time, I think it's that water source and the acidity that really allows there to be some pretty interesting esterification in Ardbeg's pretty short ferment. What do you think about that?
Yeah, but you've also got to, you mustn't forget the fact that we have wooden washbacks, which we've intentionally retained the old-fashioned wooden washbacks at Ardbeg. Many distilleries over the years have changed to stainless steel, or in fact, we're just built straight from day one with stainless steel washbacks. But wood is inherently difficult to clean, and as much as we might try, we'll never completely sterilize those fermentation vessels. So what happens, that there's a kind of resident bacteria that live in the wood there. And that certainly aids in that secondary fermentation, that malolactic fermentation that we're getting, and then a lot of autolysis of the yeast cells breaking down, and that's creating a lot of these incredible additional flavors as well. So as long as you can leave the fermentation to go even beyond the stage where the yeast is really active, you're going to develop more and more flavor as you do that. Having wooden washbacks aids in that without actually having to add too much to the length of fermentation. It's an extra aid to flavor, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah, all important stuff.
I think we can jump into the into the next slide there. That's a little bit more about Loch Ugadal and a little bit of a picture of the actual loch itself. Loch Ugadal, again, if you remember from our geomorphology class in week 2, I believe it was, that was Isla and originality, you'll remember that Loch Ugadal sits in the middle of a peat bog. And that peat bog, even though it's fed ambitropically by rainfall, that rainwater essentially runs off these quartz and granite mountains. You can not really mountains, you can call them foothills to the interior of the island. So it actually runs off really, really quickly. Ardbeg, the water source Ugadal, is low minerality but fairly high acidity due to the fact that that water runs off the quartz and granite so quickly, doesn't pick up any sort of mineral content, and then actually sits in the middle of that peat bog. Loch Ugadal is notoriously one of the deeper and larger lochs on the island that's used for whiskey production purposes. And so the distillery very rarely has to shut down in terms of not having enough water to operate with. The other thing that means is because of the fact that that water is sitting there for so long, it's kind of rubbing elbows with what is essentially a carbon sink. So, you know, the carbon sink, which is the peat bog, is going to impart kind of a little bit of an acidity. That's historically what would have been called a soft water source in the whiskey industry. Again, meaning that it has low minerality, but then also the influence of some healthy acidity as well to it.
Yeah, so, and the biggest thing there, really, beyond the chemical composition of the water, is simply the fact that Loch Ugadal, like you started with, is a big body of water, a big and cold, deep body of water. So one of the things that is the hungriest user of cold water at any distillery are the condensers, and whether it's shell and tube or, you know, worm tubs use a huge amounts of water, but you can't make single malt Scotch whiskey, you can't make spirit without cold condensers, and we don't have a problem usually with supply of cold water because of Loch Ugadal. Other distilleries on Islay have all sorts of problems. Kalila, I think, as we
I do have a question that came in.
Yeah.
I think we'll answer right now. Is a lack of water a common reason for a distillery to halt production?
It can common. I wouldn't say necessarily common, but becoming more of a thing as we start dealing with climate change, even in Scotland. We've had some of the hottest, driest summers on record in the last decade in Scotland, and you know, one of our sister distilleries on Islay, Kalila, I think, you know, Vic Cameron mentioned it to the class a few times. Kalila has a backup system because their water source is not as reliable as ours at Ardbeg. They, from time to time, will actually use seawater and pump seawater to cool into their condensers. Now, seawater has big challenges in itself, being, you know, full of salt, and that will corrode everything pretty quickly. So they use it only when they really have to. But I believe last summer they actually did have to use some seawater cooling. The kind of last resort, I guess, for everyone involved. At Ardbeg, we don't have to worry about that. You know, Loch Ugadal is really far up in the hills and big, and like Cam said, just surrounded by peat bogs. It's you know, I've been up there once, and it took me, I think it was between 9 and 11 hours to get up there and back, and frequently I was up to my waist. In several times I fell up to my waist in peat bogs. You know, Cam would love to have seen that. He'd have just left me there, I think.
I mean, I would as well.
Yeah, thanks. And most of the hike up, we were, you know, halfway up our shins every step. So it took a long time, a lot of effort. There's no path up to Loch Ugadal, and when the distillery manager gets up there, it's usually just to check that the catchment system for taking water out of the loch and down to the distillery, you know, just checking it for safety and checking nothing's wrong with it.
I guess that also leads to another question we had. Do you filter the water before use? And if is it taken from the top of the lake or a well? Like, is it from an aquifer?
It's literally taken out of the end of the loch. So there's a small kind of earthen dam at one end where we have a collection pipe. It will actually run overland from there, just free flowing through a stream, a burn, as we call it in Scotland, down to a secondary loch, Loch Earnan. And then from Loch Earnan, we pipe it down to Ardbeg Distillery, but it's just gravity fed out of those 2 lochs. Yeah, no aquifer or anything.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And this is also in reference as well. I'll just chime in here as well to the second question first. I believe it was Javier who posed it. This is production water, not proofing water, right? Water that is used to proof whiskey down does need to be treated via osmosis or reverse osmosis. So this, because it is going to go through distillation, does not necessarily get treated or processed as for the sterility that you need for proofing water.
I've heard some distilleries say over the years that they use, source water, branch water for reducing the bottling to bottling strength. Whether or not that was true in the past, I'm not going to comment on. But these days, for all sorts of food safety laws, that is not allowed. You have to use, distilled, deionized water, and there's many reasons for that. Obviously, food safety reasons, but also you want water that is as pure to just H2O as possible. If you have dissolved mineral salts in the water that you are reducing your cask strength whiskey for bottling with, you'll end up having flocculation of dissolved minerals and deposits on the bottom of the inside of the bottle, cloudiness, lumps in the bottom of your bottle, all these sort of things that people are going to go, quite rightly, nope, not drinking that. So deionized, demineralized water, as pure as we can get for bottling. In terms of what we're using through the distillery for, there's 2 elements there. There's the condensing waters, and there's the water used physically for fermentation and such like. It will all have been filtered at least through various physical filters to stop there being, what you'd find in any stream or river or loch, bits of twigs, bits of heather and dead fish, and you name it. We don't want that, appearing in our fermenters, and we don't want particles blocking up our shell and tube condensers. So of course, it will be filtered at least.
Absolutely. Perfect. Let's go ahead and get into the next slide as well. Even though we already started chit-chatting just a little bit about fermentation and the effects of having organ pine washbacks versus the relatively short fermentation time that yields such an intense fruitiness. On the nose of Ardbeg, one of the things that I pick out most readily available is green apple and kind of pear drop as well. Things that are indicative of a substantially longer fermentation time, but that at Ardbeg we achieve in just 50 to 60 hours in having the organ pine washbacks, as well as that water that that nurtures a fairly acidic environment, as well as the malolactic fermentation that happens past 40 or so odd hours, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, kind of jumping a little bit ahead. But even though we have that relatively short fermentation time, yes, we've got the aid of the wooden washbacks coming in there. But you can also affect the final flavor profile by where you place your spirit cut when we talk about distillation. And the spirit cut at Ardbeg is cut in a way that we get some of those fruity notes, those notes that Cam was mentioning, but we also pick up the right components of the phenols that give us the smoky notes as well. So it's important to realize it's not just fermentation that creates that.
And phenols and fermentation are interesting as well, and I'm glad that you actually mentioned that before we jump into distillation as well. Phenols and fermentation, as if you were a whiskey producer trying to maximize your potential yield, the last thing that you would want is anything that is inhibiting or restricting, or constraining the amount of pure alcohol by volume that you can potentially yield from 1 ton of barley, which generally at maximum efficiency is going to be what's called a 410 or 410 liters of pure spirit. but heavily peated whiskeys, phenols actually inhibit and reduce the overall yield. So I'm told that at Ardbeg we're getting around 390 to 400 liters out of 1 ton of malted barley, which is very interesting as well, because it's one of those things where it's not necessarily how much you make, but the quality of the new made spirit that you're making.
Yeah, and just the location on Islay as well requires us to make some different choices when it comes to the form of yeast that we're using. So at Glenmorangie, our sister distillery on the mainland, good access throughout the year to supplies. We don't have to have the same issues and same concerns. Whereas and so we can use yeast. We can use yeast that's delivered directly or propagated, and we can use liquid yeast on Islay. Cam, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm trying to think if it's still the case. I think we're using dried yeast of some description or creamed yeast right now. And that's to allow us to be able to have sacks and sacks of the stuff sitting around stable. So in the middle of winter, like we had last week with a lot of snow in parts of the UK or strong winds and storms, the worst thing in the world would be to run out of yeast. Nothing happens at that point. So we can be a bit more, we can have a stockpile at Ardbeg. It gives us a bit of leeway there.
Yeah, that is a really good point. Part of the whiskey production process is one part magic, and then another part is forecasting as well. Because of accessibility to raw ingredients and whatnot, oftentimes if you play your hand wrong, distillery production has to halt. And especially for a distillery that's the size of Ardbeg, which is not incredibly monstrous by any stretch of the imagination. Emergencies, I would imagine, when they do come through, would be, I guess, not as quickly responded to as if we were a distillery that was, say, 4 to 5 times our size.
Well, yeah, and the other part of it is that, we're part of people will say, oh, you're part of LVMH, massive company. Yeah, but, when we look at the Scotch whiskey distilling capacities of our company, we have 2 distilleries, one that's a medium-sized single malt distillery, Glenmorangie, and one that's a pretty small single malt distillery, Ardbeg. We don't have any grain production, and that's our game in Scotland, Glenmorangie and Ardbeg. Whereas just on Islay, if you look at Diageo, there's Kalila, there's Lagavulin, there's Port Ellen Maltings, there'll be Port Ellen Distillery before long. They have a whole operation just on Islay and another 20 plus distilleries. What is it, 24 distilleries or something in total in Scotland. So internally they have teams that will service things and fix things. They have backup systems, all the rest of it in the way that we just don't have. We don't have that scale. Yeah. So things can affect us. And luckily on Islay, particularly in Scotland in general, in the Scotch industry, but particularly on Islay, a lot of the parts, in terms of pipeworks and valves and all the rest of it are interchangeable. There's a lot of commonality. And if something breaks and we don't have it, it will be loaned to us from one of our competitors even sometimes. So there's a bit of that going on. But we've had an instance, and an Ardbeg that's coming out early in 2022 is the result of something we wanted to do, an experiment we wanted to do involving very long fermentation times, incredibly long fermentation times. And we'd had it chalked in to do that experiment at some point. And then our boiler broke down, dead of winter, and it was going to be 2 weeks at least till the parts arrived. This was the old boiler. And the then distillery manager, Mickey Hedge, phoned up Bill Lumsden and said, what am I going to do? And Bill said, right, perfect opportunity to put this project, bring it ahead and do it right now. And we left the fermentation to go for 2.5 weeks. Literally wild stuff going on in there. And that's something that we'll get to taste early in 2022. Should have been out already, but, good old pandemic logistical issues. We have to be a little bit more patient.
That's a really great example, and I'm so excited for that whiskey, which we cannot name drop as of yet, but has the best name. I'm very excited for that whiskey to come out in early 2022. But then also another really great example of that as well is if you go back to last week's conversation with Colin Gordon, specifically when we were talking about the bobby mill, which Ardbeg uses, which is a multiple roller mill to crush down that barley or the raw ingredient. It gets a once a year checkup, and there is one person who services all of the Robert Bobby mills, and that piece of equipment just celebrated its 100th birthday, I believe 100 or 106th birthday. No, it was 100. It was 100, yeah, because it went in 1921. So that piece of equipment just celebrated its 100th birthday at the distillery. And there's one person and his son who are in charge with servicing all of the bobby mills, of which there are not a whole lot of them anymore. But that's just another great example of the difficulties that can be presented to a said distillery before even talking about process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that guy and his son are actually responsible for all the Porteous mills as well. I think I think if I remember the history of it is that the company Robert Bobby that made the bobby mills ended up being bought by Porteous. I think I may be wrong, but certainly pretty sure that the one guy services basically every mill of that era left in the UK. So we're all quite relieved that his son is starting to be trained up, because otherwise we've got a big problem coming. He's not the youngest guy in the world.
Job security, though. Security.
Seriously. Well, the very reason that Porteous and Bobby both ended up going out of business was they made mills that were too good. Yeah. They never broke. And it looks, apart from the fact it's clearly got like 100 and something years worth of layers of paint on it, it looks like it's brand new. It's crazy. You take the rollers out, you look inside, the thing looks like it's straight out of the Victorian showroom. It's insane.
Built to last. Yeah.
Yeah.
It looked like we maybe had another question before we move ahead and start talking about distillation, which at Ardbeg is one of the weirder and wackier kind of phases in the production process. So
there wasn't a question as much as people were very excited about this new release, and I wanted to show you that with my eyebrows. So.
Oh, awesome. Yeah.
Well, it certainly worked.
We have a lot of comments saying that they want release parties, they want to help. So this is exciting for a lot of people, myself included.
Excited. Yeah, and the eyebrows are killing it as well. The eyebrows kill it. Love it. Let's go ahead and jump into discussion a little bit about distillation. So this is one of my favorite things, because I think this is where you get to really see the heartbeat of Ardbeg start to shine through. Of course, distillation isn't proprietary to Scotland or even to Ardbeg. The process of making a single malt Scotch whiskey involves pot still batch distillation. 130 so odd distilleries are spread out across the country. All feature some form of batch pot still distillation. But one of my favorite things about Ardbeg stills is going to be that purifier that sits off of the line arm. I think that is one of the areas, in addition to having a relatively short heads run as well. I mean, that is also very unique. That means that Ardbeg is capturing a lot of those light, very fruity and floral aromatics that happen to be higher volatility and start to run off of the still a bit sooner. We're able to capture a lot more of those because of the existence of the purifier. Some of those compounds are going to go right back into the still for additional distillation, call it forced reflux as well. But what are your thoughts on the purifier and its net effect through the lens of Ardbeg Tenure there, Mr. Blackmore?
Yeah, I mean, I actually really like an old marketing term that we use to kind of explain the purifier in a sort of soundbite, and that is it's responsible for Ardbegs Pt Paradox. And by that I mean we smoke our barley to within an inch of its life, to these insane levels. And yet the whiskey that we end up with at Ardbeg, of course, it's pretty in-your-face smoke, particularly if you're new to smoky whiskeys. It's going to be pretty in your face. But there is an element of complexity there are other flavor elements in there. It's not just peat. And I suspect if we were to somehow take the purifier off the Ardbeg spirit stills, you would see something that was much, much more aggressive. And some people would love that. You know, the real peat freaks would love that. But I think what you would lose is complexity and diversity of flavor in there. You would end up with a one-note whiskey, just peat, a peat smoke and nothing else. And I much prefer, that's not what Ardbeg is. Ardbeg's about this, like you said, that creaminess, those fruity, almost overly fruity tropical fruit notes. Ardbeg has tension in its flavor profile. Often in the older whiskeys, when you I pick up like pineapple that's right on the verge of being too ripe, where you might throw that pineapple in the trash, right on the balancing edge. And when we get it right, just the right tension of that's good. Oh, wait. There's some almost like the cream on top of a full fat thing of milk. There's a creaminess there. Again, sometimes it's right on. Is that milk still good? Just on the edge, you know, on the turn. Those are for me dynamic flavors that bring tension, that bring this whiskey to life, and create the interest in it. And of course, then you've got the smoke as well. So a lot of that is coming from the purifier, and a lot of it would be masked if we took the purifier off as well. Yeah. So what would be fun would be to have a purifier that we could turn on and off through a distillation cycle, so that we could capture nothing at certain points and then turn it on and capture a bunch of stuff. So wouldn't that be fun? Who knows?
That would be absolutely amazing. I'm wondering if maybe one of the two distilleries that reside within the Glenmorangie company have built any highly experimental new stills.
Funny you should say that, Cam. Yes, we have. So up at Glenmorangie, and not to get onto Glenmorangie for too long, but we have built a kind of pilot experimental still house, separate to the main still house at Glenmorangie. We've called it the Lighthouse because it's a great big tall glass tower with two stills, a set of Glenmorangie shaped stills in there. And to the first glance, they just look like another couple of Glenmorangie stills. But if you really look carefully, there's all sorts of bells and whistles on there. We have cooling jackets, heating and cooling jackets on the necks of the stills, which can do all sorts of funky things, changing the dynamics of the reflux. And one of the most obvious things is at the top of these tall Glenmorangie stills are a set of purifiers that look like they've been stolen out of the Ardbeg still house. And yes, we're going to be playing with all sorts of things there at Glenmorangie, playing with purifiers to try and learn a bit more about what we could do maybe, and some of that might rub off on Ardbeg one day. Of course, we've just expanded and built a new still house at Ardbeg, and the old still house is still sitting there, right? Mm-hmm. I've asked several people. I've asked Bill Lumsden, I've asked Colin Gordon, what's going to happen to the old still house? And they've just kind of changed the subject. It would be awfully fun, wouldn't it, if that old still house was kept and used for an experimentation lab as well. But honestly, genuinely have no idea if that is going to happen. Probably not, to be honest.
If they watch this, I think we're both throwing our hat in the ring there,
yes,
saying we would love an experimental distillery at Ardbeg for further experimentation, either that or maybe potentially bring back in some capacity the malting floors as well at Ardbeg.
Yeah, that would be fun too. You know, and it could be fun to take the purifier off the one still that's no longer being used.
Yes,
as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I
have
a question. What era was the purifier added to this still? Was it always there?
There's a lot of intrigue and confusion about that. The short answer is we don't know. We don't have any records for certain. But Cam, I think the general consensus within the company is that it probably went in, the purifier was probably installed either between the First and Second World War or directly after the Second.
Oh, wow.
One or the other. I think that's the consensus, right?
Yeah, I think that those are the two stories that I've heard as well. The third one that I've heard as well is that it potentially could have gone in sometime in the 60s.
Okay.
Hamish, who was running the distillery during the part of the 60s and into the 70s as well, was a dreamer in terms of dreaming up a lot of potential distillery expansions for Ardbeg. And actually, what's interesting is he came to Ardbeg Distillery from a rum producing distillery as well. He's worked in high ester spirits. He had worked in high ester spirits for the majority of his life in tenure and career. So the other theory is that potentially it could have gone in there, but I'm open to all three of them. But as David said,
I think he came from making rum in Guyana.
Yeah,
I think. And it was the Diamond Distillery in Guyana. And that distillery, I don't know if it had it at the time, but they have all sorts of wild and wacky stills, including, and I still haven't quite got my head around how this works, but wooden stills. They have wooden stills.
I've heard of those before. That's
Right.
crazy.
Yeah.
Another question that came in is, how many stills does Ardbeg now have in the new still house?
Over to you, Cam.
Oh, well, so we've gone from having 2 stills to now having 4 stills at Ardbeg. So the distillery expansion was absolutely an expansion. The theoretical capacity of Ardbeg is going to increase slowly over the next few years. Last year, I guess, even going back to 2018 and 2019, the distillery made about 1.6 million liters of spirit. That will slowly ramp up to basically being about 2.6 over the next few years. So not a total doubling in capacity, but moving in the correct direction.
Yeah,
real close.
The kind of choke point in the past was distillation. Now the choke point with the new still house is actually fermentation. So there's some work now being done to increase the fermentation capacity at Ardbeg. But that's what will hold us back more than anything right now.
Absolutely.
Thank you both.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the choke point being distillation. The way that the old still house operated, it was, again, one of the things I love to say is that Ardbeg has some inefficiencies, but in the most beautiful ways, and correctly placed inefficiencies that allow for the flavors to develop into what we get into our glasses. So one of the things and one of the areas was the lab in between the wash still and the spirit still. The spirit stills at Ardbeg, historically being larger than the wash stills, would take 2 fills of the wash still to fit one spirit still. So that meant that there had to be a kind of a pause as you had parcel B distilling in the wash still to catch up to parcel A. So that meant that parcel A was allowed an opportunity to kind of see a little bit more esterification, which to me adds to that PD paradox that David had mentioned earlier.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, the kind of budget expansion that we could have done, luckily we didn't, would have been to just throw another wash still in.
Yeah.
And we could have been making a bit more Ardbeg that way, I think. But glad we didn't do that.
100% agreed as well. Right, let's dive back into the presentation here. So we got a little bit of a conversation in about distillation. Now let's talk about maturation and microclimate. So this is, again, kind of a melding of our Islay and originality class, as well as some of the concepts that we introduced with Mr. Colin Gordon as well. Again, maturation isn't necessarily a proprietary approach to whiskey production, but the way that Ardbeg moves through maturation with its core range, the varying styles of cask that are utilized for whole components to be left and matured separately, but then brought together, is in fact quite unique. And then the microclimate of Islay as well is quite unique in terms of Scotland as well. So if you were to go back to that Islay and originality class, one of the things that you would notice is that, well, there's over 150 days of rainfall on Islay. That unfortunately is actually moving in the wrong direction. Again, somebody had asked earlier about production water and how often is it that production has to cease due to lack of water. Unfortunately, that is happening more and more often as the rainy season on Isla, which is I should say almost all year long, but the rain is starting to get a little bit more sporadic there as well. But in addition to heavy rainfall, Isla is actually the beneficiary of some pretty unique kind of Gulf coastal trade winds that blow directly over the island itself, which actually ensures that the temperature is a little bit warmer year round and actually a little bit more humid year round than it is on mainland Scotland as well. So although that doesn't necessarily drive the overall flavor profile of whiskeys aged on Isla specifically in one particular direction, I do think it is at least worth mentioning as well, especially when we're talking about whiskeys that are aged in ex-bourbon casks, because those bourbon casks, we're not necessarily looking for what the previous occupant has left in, but what the previous occupant has removed from that cask. So temperature, pressure, and time, there are conversations to be had there, especially when you're talking about ex-bourbon. What are your thoughts there, David?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And there's always a balance here between kind of acknowledging that there will be some differences in the way that the casks mature on Isla to some parts of the mainland, for example, but not to overstate it. You know, it's easy to jump in and say, oh, it makes such a difference. Can't you taste it immediately? And the big lie I've always thought of is in the industry is this idea that, oh, warehouses and distilleries that are next to the ocean, or you can taste the saltiness in the whiskey. But until you take a step back and find out that when Scotch whiskies have been analyzed many, many, many times, they've never found salt in any samples. So, you know, if salt isn't there, it's not coming from the salty sea air and what you're picking up on your palate. I'm not saying that you don't pick up a saltiness in your whiskey. I do. Most people do quite often pick up this kind of saline brininess in some whiskeys. But what it is more intriguing to me. It's a combination of all sorts of other flavor active molecules that are coming together to give an impression on your palate of a saltiness there. So, you know, Ardbegs distilleries, warehouses, you know, here's a model of one right here. And Glenmorangie's warehouses are pretty much within a matter of a few feet, as close to the ocean as each other. But you hear people saying Ardbeg has all this briny saltiness in it. And we don't really hear people talking about Glenmorangie in the same way. So be careful when you're talking about that for certain. And what I like is that whilst we've done some science to disprove some things, the science in terms of what's actually going on isn't all there. We can't quite explain what's going on. And frankly, the day that science completely explains every mystery of Scotch whiskey, the whole thing will be considerably less interesting and much more prosaic hobby and industry to be in. So I'm okay with us not knowing everything and not understanding it all. But yeah, just be clear, it's not salt you're picking up in a glass. It's other things.
Let them be whiskey romantics. Yeah, let them be romantic. But I absolutely agree. I definitely don't think that that's and I would think that Vic would probably agree as well. Yeah. That you know that's not necessarily where the flavors that salinity is coming from, because they haven't been able to pick out specifically salt from any sort of test.
And that shouldn't be too surprising, because when you taste other things, you know, this concept of umami, that sort of extra taste sensation, that can be generated from all sorts of things. You know, when you taste mushrooms, or you're tasting soy sauce or whatever it is, you're getting that kind of umami sensation. And I think sometimes that, combined with just the blistering complexity of single malt Scotch whiskey, can trick your palate, can make you think you're picking up some things. And you know, the last point on that is, when I take a glass of Ardbeg 10 and I nose it and I taste it, almost every single time I taste it and nose it, it's a new experience. Mm-hmm. Yeah, broadly, I get a lot of similarities from one glass to the next, but I'm picking up nuances, different things, exciting new flavors every single time. That's not because the whiskey's fluctuating. That's because I'm fluctuating.
Mhm.
You know, the most inconsistent part of this whole dynamic is the end user, it's the drinker. And isn't it great? That's why we're all in this industry, and or why we love whiskey, is that debate, that healthy debate of, I pick up, you know, whatever it is in this whiskey, and you go, no, I don't get that at all. And you say you pick up something else, and I don't get that at all. Neither of us are right or wrong. It's that's what's so much fun about it all. If you pick it up, then it's there. Trust your palate.
I agree. You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. David Blackmore called himself inconsistent, and I love to hear it. I love to hear it. I love to hear it. No, but another thought.
Cameron, George, you're very consistent, but I won't say why.
I love you. I love you. One of the things as well that I think is, attributed wholly to maturation is, of course, the coloration of a whiskey as well. So we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the color of Ardbeg Tenure as well, because as Brendan McCarran used to say, this whiskey is quite rough and ready, if that's my best Brendan McCarran impression there as well. This whiskey, especially Ardbegs, don't necessarily take coloration too heavily. You really have to bludgeon this whiskey with either virgin American oak or sherry casks that have been used for extended maturation. I'm thinking about like a whiskey like Uigeadail, which some of those component whiskeys are aged for quite an extensive amount of time in sherry cask as well. But you really have to bludgeon an Ardbeg to get it to take color incredibly well. The tenure I describe as kind of an auric gold coloration to it. There's this kind of gold aura that halos this whiskey. One of my absolute favorites to look at in the glass, because of the fact that it is so light, but the way it moves in its glass tells a completely different story. I'm a firm believer that we're visual eaters and drinkers before anything else. So the way that a whiskey smells and tastes is great, but we can learn a lot about how a whiskey is going to feel based on how it moves around in its glass as well. And there's some lipid characteristics to, in qualities to Ardbeg as it moves around in its glass. Even the Pt Paradox, again, in terms of the color, but then the way that it's going to move and the way that it's going to feel when I'm drinking it.
So one of the key things here is that I think a lot of people might be put off by our 10-year-olds, how light it is in color. Certainly not our core, Pete Freak Ardbeg fan. They're knowledgeable enough and they understand. But if you think about beyond that to the kind of new whiskey drinkers, I think people expect Scotch whiskey often to be this sort of dark mahogany, to quote Ron Burgundy, that richness. And one of the things that I think really just by chance has helped Ardbeg is the fact that we've got a dark green bottle, and you don't judge the whiskey by its color on the shelf because you can't see it. And once it's in the glass, you may have a fraction of a second going, oh, that looks lighter than I expected. Oh my gosh, that's intensely flavored, and the aroma is intense. So Ardbeg 10 is the perfect whiskey if you're having an argument with someone who says, the color of the whiskey is an indication of how richly flavored that whiskey will be. Just pour them a glass of Ardbeg 10 and completely stop the conversation.
No, I would like to get your thoughts on a legal loophole. Sorry, little slip of the tongue there, which is E150A, the use of E150A in the Scotch whiskey industry. Obviously, with Ardbeg, kind of two core Ardbegian elements and kind of bench posts are that, one, we don't chill filter any of the whiskeys. There was a chill filtered release in the past, which was quite interesting actually as well. But that's for another conversation.
That was done for a reason as an experiment.
That was done for a reason. That was done for a strategic reason, a specific reason. But we chill filter our whiskeys and we don't add any E150A, the caramel coloring as well. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on caramel coloring, what it does to the visual perception of perception of a whiskey, and then also your thoughts on can it manipulate flavor? Can you taste E150A?
It's a good one. I personally don't get quite as stressed out about it as some of the real whiskey kind of geek community do. And that's for a couple of reasons. Let's start by saying, if I had the choice, I personally would love it if caramel coloring wasn't in my whiskey. I don't think it needs to be. Those of us that drink Scotch whiskey understand that color doesn't correlate to flavor. But you are right. People drink with their eyes. They eat with their eyes, and that's even up to the people that make these whiskeys. I don't have it right here, but we often use dark blue glass nosing and Glencairn glasses in the lab, because even the best nose, even the best whiskey blender can be subconsciously, skewed by the color of the whiskey. So to get to the point, I think if caramel is used sparingly, this stuff is incredibly powerful in terms of changing the color of whiskey. A drop or two in a whole vatting will change the color of a whiskey. And will you be able to detect the flavor? No, you will not. I absolutely challenge you and I confidently challenge you that you would not be able to pick out the flavor of a couple of drops, a tiny amount sparingly used spirit caramel. You just won't. The analysis is there. The facts are there. You won't. Having said that, and not to name any brand names ever, but I can think of some brands and some bottom shelf, cheapest blended scotches on the block where the color is so dark and the whiskey is clearly going to be young because of the age the price point of that blend. And when you get to that point, yes, sometimes there, almost the only flavor characteristic available is that kind of caramel note that you get from overuse of spirit caramel. So like most things in life, it's not black and white. It's much more shades of gray. Use it carefully if you do. What's the benefits of using it? Well, there are some benefits to using it. The big benefit for me is reassuring new consumers, new people, bringing them in slowly into the fold. Rarely is someone going to go from 0 to 100 in the world of getting into single malt overnight. So hold their hands a little bit. There's a time and a place for it, used carefully. But when you've tasted whiskies where it's clearly been heaped with spirit caramel, not for me, thanks very much. And I think I'm dominating the conversation here, but one thing and this is not a company point of view at all, this is just my thoughts. I think it would be awesome personally if in the future it wasn't allowed in single malt Scotch, but was still allowed maybe in blended Scotch. And I think that would be a nice compromise, but that's just me.
I actually really like that. I actually really, really appreciate that viewpoint. And I can see the legs for the argument kind of developing there as well. And I also like how you put it as well, that it's not as black and white, that there are shades of gray.
Absolutely.
It's a wonderful, wonderful pun. And I have the very same feeling about chill filtration as well, even though it's not a practice that we partake in for Ardbeg. I think that's by design. We want to leave in solution all of those lipid fats that kind of aid, and add to the muckiness, the creamy aspects of Ardbeg. But for some particular drams out there, I'm actually thinking of like Glenmorangie Original. It is a better structured whiskey when it is lightly chill filtered.
Yeah, and again, shades of gray. Chill filtration is not a switch. It's not an either or. Exactly. You can vary the level that you chill the spirit. You can vary it by the size, the membrane that you pass the chilled spirit through. And when we do it at Glenmorangie, and that's not across the whole range, we do it very lightly. And again, the proof there is, if you want to see proof of that, go grab a bottle of Glenmorangie Original and pour it over a big ice cube and leave it for a few minutes. It'll cloud up. It wouldn't cloud up if it had been heavily chill filtered. I must say, one last point on that with Glenmorangie Original. In the USA, I think US is one of the only markets where Glenmorangie Original is bottled at 43%, not 40. no idea why. It's been lost in the mists of time. It's always been 43 in the States, and so a bit less of a chill filtration, I suspect. A little bit more alcohol for the lipids to sit in. We've done studies, and on average, people can't tell the difference. Blind nosing and tasting the 40% to the US 43% Glenmorangie Original. The people that have managed to pass the test to be part of our whiskey creation team, on average, can taste the difference. So,
yeah, absolutely
interesting.
I mean, talking about Gillian McDonald and of course Dr. Bill Lumsden as well. Two honestly of the best in the industry at analyzing flavor profile and spirit profile.
Question came in: how many levels of chill filtering are there?
I don't know if it works that way. I think it's a tweaking of the temperature and gradient. I'm not an expert at that at all, and so I don't know the answer. If I know Vic is on here and made a few comments. If Vic wants to throw something up, if he has a bit more insight on that, that would be great. But as far as I know, there's probably a set of different filters, but in terms of changing the temperature, that's probably something that each company and each bottling line manager, stroke distillery, master distiller, master blender works out themselves.
Yeah,
I think we all need a Vic button that we can just press in our home to have questions answered.
for every Vic button. Luke, I can imagine to David's kind of answer there as well. It doesn't work the same way as, like, say, char level in a cask, right? Yeah. Where it's all right. You've got char levels 1 through char level 5 or 4, depending on who you ask there. I would imagine it doesn't work the exact same. Like, there's chill filtration level 1 through level 10 or so. I would imagine that there are a specific set of micron filters with a fine enough membrane, probably starting wider and then getting progressively smaller. And then also, to David's point as well, the degree in terms of the temperature is left up to the distiller, blender, bottling line manager as well.
I suspect there's a third parameter as well, which is how quickly you pass the liquid through the filter.
Absolutely. Pressure as well.
Yeah, filter size, temperature, speed. Exactly. Yeah,
we hit the Vic button. We hit the Vic button.
We hit the Vic button.
Hit the Vic button, and the Vic camera, the VC symbol goes up in the clouds. Da, 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 da.
Exactly. I love it. Right. So let's dive in now fully into the whiskey. Now that we've recapped in just under an hour, we've recapped Loch Ugadal, the water source, which provides a soft water that is devoid of mineral content, but does have a certain acidity to it. We've dove back into fermentation, back through distillation, into maturation, and now let's talk with a little bit more kind of depth about Ardbeg Tenure, when this whiskey was relaunched as well, because this is the flagship of the distillery, but the route to getting back to being able to offer a 10-year-old whiskey was not easy. Ardbeg Distillery was shuttered and closed for the majority of the 80s and much of the 90s as well, before ultimately being shuttered in 1996, almost being destroyed and knocked down in 1996, and then being revived in 1997. That meant that there wasn't a whole lot of stock profiles sitting around from the early 80s and 90s for us to be able to leverage as Ardbeg 10-year-old whiskey. So, David, can you tell us about the PD path to maturity and how we went those young whiskeys?
Cam, come on! I thought you'd want to tell us all about the 1980s.
Yeah,
but you weren't alive, were you?
I made it to the 80s party. I'm an 89 baby, so I made it to the. I showed up. Yeah.
You showed up just.
Just in time.
So yeah, like you said, Ardbeg, the previous owners during the tragic whiskey slump of the 80s, whiskey slump, Ardbeg was shuttered completely from 81 to 89, and then the world heard that Cameron George had been born, and Ardbeg Distillery was started up again in 1990. And that's actually an important factor because, Cam, correct me if I'm right here, 1990, so 2000, Ardbeg 10 was relaunched in 2000, I believe that's right, yeah. So that would have meant that we would, and it actually wasn't the first whiskey that Ardbeg released under the Glenmorangie Company ownership after 97 when we bought the distillery. We had released the 17-year-olds, which involved some of the stock that we inherited from the 70s. And over the 3 or 4 years that we bottled the 17, it actually ended up being much older whiskey than 17. But we wanted to keep a consistent label to get people interested in and have a consistent thing to market. So the last bottlings of Ardbeg 17, some of them were up 20, 21 years old in the bottling. 1990 was the year when the previous owners actually did a fair bit of distilling. And that's crucial because that allowed us to have something that had been maturing for a decade. So in 2000, we had something to bottle as the first 10-year-old. And of course, from 97 onwards, we started distilling in earnest again under the Glenmorangie regime. So 97, 2007, from 2007 onwards, things have got not easy, but just slightly less tight every year in terms of the stocks that we've got available to us. In amongst that, though, we did bottle, as Cam mentioned, the PT Path to Maturity with a series of small releases of that distillate, showing it maturing towards 10 years. So there we go, Ardbeg, and this was way before non-age statement controversies and young whiskies being bottled. And way back then, Ardbeg came out with whiskies that controversially, in your face, said, what's the age? Well, this one's called Ardbeg Very Young. This one's called Ardbeg Still Young. Ardbeg Almost There. Yes, we did do that, and a series of whiskies showing our distillate as it was maturing until 2007, where we now had 10-year-old stock that we had distilled, 2007, 2008 spirit, 10-year-old spirit that we had distilled. Great fun, great to see as a whiskey geek, but it's kind of also robbing our future, wasn't it? Because every bottle of Very Young that was bought was a bottle of 10-year-old that we couldn't sell in the future.
Yeah. And I mean, a bottle plus some of 10-year-old, because looking at these, Almost There is 54.1, Still Young is 56.2. Ardbeg Tenure being bottled at 46. Yep. That's bottle in some change, that it could have gone to.
Totally. So we it was a fun thing for sure, but that was the kind of resurrection of this house style of Ardbeg. And yeah, we first came out with Ardbeg 10 in 2000, but it took us another decade to get it to be our liquid that we had distilled, and really get it where we want it. But it's fabulous whiskey.
In the 17-year-old whiskey, the 17 was absolutely fantastic. And of course, was the first age statemented whiskey to be released after the acquisition of the distillery. But to your point, it became difficult to keep up with that whiskey because of the fact that they were having to rely on older and older stock. Because there was no whiskey really from the 1980s sitting around. 1990 was an iconic year for Ardbeg, as it was a full production year. But I mean, really, they made drops in the bucket, as production in 1990 would have been about 1 million liters. So drastically smaller than we made in 2019, and actually even smaller than what we were distilling back in the 1890s, as well as the distillery would have been making a little.
And crucially, even though we distilled quite a lot, or they distilled quite a lot in 1990, that production was intended for blending. The company that owned Ardbeg had several blended Scotch brands, big names, and therefore what Ardbeg from 1990 was still in the warehouse in our warehouses in our ownership when we bought the distillery in 1997 wasn't much. It wasn't like we had a 1 million liters worth of 7-year-old whiskey. in the warehouse. Nothing like that. You know, it had been used in their own blends or sold and traded with other blenders. Ardbeg Spirit, very smoky, very pungent, always in high demand by blenders because it can, you know, it's like the salt and pepper on your steak, I guess, or your hot sauce on your fajita or something. It changes the flavor profile of a blend so dynamically. You don't need a lot, but it's highly in demand.
Mm-hmm. You know, and that's one of the things as well. I think that the tenure is so important to the life force of the distillery because it actually is the lifeblood of the distillery. Yeah. First, second, third fill ex-bourbon barrels exclusively, a marriage of those three varying styles of ex-bourbon cask being utilized there. Cheeky little bit of third fill ex-bourbon, I should add there as well. But the reason that that's so important is because we utilize this as kind of the heartbeat of every other whiskey that comes from the distillery, even now to today, whether it's Ugal or even 19 or Corey Vrecken. The lion's share of those whiskeys are matured out for their entire maturation in ex-bourbon casks. So we wouldn't be able to do any of the committee bottlings, any of the, you know, bespoke avant-garde bottlings that we attempt each year if we didn't make whiskey in this style first and foremost.
Yeah, and that's just to be very clear though. Whilst you're absolutely right, the majority of Ardbegs rely on that kind of 10-year-old house style at their heart. With trial and error, even though Bill Lumsden's the kind of known as the finishing guy, the guy who brought the art of wood finishing to the masses and really it's a thing with Glenmorangie. When we've tried it at Ardbeg, it doesn't really seem to work. The spirit's very different. So it is much more of full maturation in this silo, you know, this type of cask, full maturation there, full maturation in another type of cask, and then the old-fashioned way of kind of blending those cask types back together. And I think we were probably talking about Aloe in previous weeks, where that's taken to another level with those marrying vats, where there's, you know, 3 component parts that Bill talks about, but another 3 or 4 component parts in Aloe that he won't talk about, and they're all full maturations and then brought together. For 10-year-olds, you know, it seems odd to people when you describe that, but you know, all whiskey's that, unless it's a single cask. All whiskey's pretty much that. Even the 10-year-old, like you said, first fill, second fill, and some third fill, full maturations put together. That's again different flavor profiles between the 3. We've both had the great opportunity to taste first, second, third fill Ardbeg out of barrels at the warehouse. They're really quite different, you know, yeah. And everybody has their favorite. You know, first fill, when you first try a first fill Ardbeg 10, it's brilliant. It's creamy as anything. And then you try the second fill and go, oh, okay, this is a bit more grown up. You know, it's got a bit more herbaceous notes to it, for example. Yeah, there's a bit less of the wood coming in. Third fill's different again. You bring them all 3 together and you have a great team of blenders and you get more than the sum of the parts, for sure.
100%.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, I just wanted to come in and see how we're doing. Are we feeling good about what we got across for today's grain to glass?
Absolutely loving it. My glass is basically empty there as well, so right on cue. I might as well kill it off. Cheers, Slàinte mhath, David.
Cheers,
mate. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Obviously, if you love this class, make sure you go back and take a look at the other classes. Share this class with people. I know there's lots of people who have lots of questions about Ardbeg. This is so many answers in each one of these live streams. If you aren't already following us on Facebook, please do. If you also aren't following us on our YouTube or Instagram, please do. These are great ways to find out. And we have one more class with these 2 very intelligent gentlemen. The one I'm most excited about, it's the periodic table, which has become one of my favorite terms in reference to the flavors inside of Ardbeg. So we are going to dive deep into that. That is next Wednesday. Make sure you're there for that one. And that one's going to be, I mean, bring your notepad. That's the one that we're going to want to share a lot of. Thank you both so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Of course, you know, if I can add as well for next week, if you'd like to taste along with us, we'll probably be revisiting Ardbeg 10-year-old. We'll also go ahead and revisit Wee Beastie and Anneau as well. So best way to go ahead and taste along with us is actually to go out and get yourself one of these Monsters of Smoke trio packs as well that has all 3 of those delicious whiskeys in them. So you can follow along as we fill out the periodic table,
and those are available pretty widely now, right? Yeah,
absolutely.
So if you're like me and you already drank your pack that you got through the EWA program, you can go hopefully find one as well. I know I'm going to be giving a couple for Christmas gifts, which I'm excited about. But thank you again both so much. We'll see you again next time.
Of course.
Thanks.
Cheers.